What's up, everybody? Welcome back to First Round Frenzy. Matt and Cole here. We did Cole's top 50. Now it's time for mine. So this time Cole's going to be leading the way, asking the questions, running us through it, and I'll be going through my top 50. So Cole, I'll just give it straight to you. How you doing? And you're gonna lead it off.
Pretty good. I'm excited to see the differences. I mean, I've gotten the spoiler already to go ahead and give some prompts and discussion here. But I'm excited to see where this conversation goes and kind of how we break down these players and, the ones that checked out my top 50, the differences from your top 50. So, without further ado, Matt, let's go ahead and get into it the same way we did the one last time, 50 to number one, break it up in groups of 10. So we'll start with number 50. You had Ty Robinson, interior defensive lineman out of Nebraska. 49, you had Siobhan Revel, cornerback out of ECU. 48, you had Femi Oladeo, defensive end from UCLA. 47, Travion Henderson, running back, Ohio State. 46, Jaden Higgins, wide receiver, Iowa State. 45, Darius Alexander, interior D lineman out of Toledo. 44, Jack Sawyer, edge out of Ohio State. Ariante Agersbury at 43, tackle out of Minnesota. And then Shadur Sanders, 42, quarterback out of Colorado, your spotlight player of this section. And then 41 to close out this section, Maxwell Hairston, cornerback out of Kentucky. So, Matt, I do want to start with the two defensive linemen here at 50 and 48. Ty Robinson and Femi Oladeo, two guys I did not have in my top 50, which is why I want to start the question, the discussion here. I'm starting to really like Femi, actually.
Yeah.
He was right on the outside of my top 50 list, but you had both Ty Robinson, who had a good combine, and Femi Oladeo, who are seeing a lot of, recent news about. What made those two guys crack into your top 50?
Yeah, for me, I just really like. We'll start with Ty Robinson. I just really like what he brings to the table. Obviously, you already mentioned the pro day. Sorry, not the pro day. The combine was a great performance out of him. He was one of the most consistent players throughout all of the on-field drills, uh, and he was good in the physicals as well. And when I watch the tape, he's a disruptor, right? He's effective in pass rush. He's effective in the run game. He's a leader. He's got plenty of experience, and he's a borderline guy. I think there were some other guys at other positions that, I was thinking of potentially putting in, but I think Ty Robinson is one of those guys that is going to be a huge value pick in the later part of the second round, potentially early third round. And I also just think the interior defensive line is so deep in this class. He deserved a spot in the top 50 based on how he ranks amongst the other defensive linemen. For Femi, I mean, I love him. You just said he's just outside your top 50. I think the tape speaks for itself. He's really effective on the outside as an edge rusher. He can line up on the inside and blitz through the gaps as well. Good run defender. And with the edge rushing group, I think in this bottom half, it's really interesting. There are some other guys that I just left off that I could have put into this spot. We're talking about obviously Femi, then we're talking about Braden Swinson out of LSU. We're talking about Nick Scourton, who's not on my list, who also just missed out. And, we've talked about it all the time. This entire defensive line group is so deep in this class that, I just felt you can see on the right, nine edge rushers in this group, not including Jalen Walker, as I have him listed as a linebacker. So there's a lot. There's definitely, by the time draft comes around, maybe he's a guy that slips out, but he's someone that's climbing up my board. So I'd actually expect, if anything, for him to move up more than down more.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of buzz about Femi, actually. He's
Yep.
one where my working mock right now, with a little spoiler coming ahead to that, but I put him in it, actually, the first round. And I don't know if I'm going to keep him there, but Washington had a entire brass. Peters, Newmark, and Quinn were all at the UCLA Pro Day, and they're bringing him in for a top 30 visit. And I don't know if he's going to go in the first round, but I look back at some of my other mock drafts that were my final ones over the years. 2021, I had Boogie Basham to the Buffalo Bills in the first round, and they, of course, take Gregory Rousseau instead. But
Yep.
Boogie Basham in the second round comes back around to Buffalo, and they take him. And last year, I had Kingsley Suma in the first round of the Kansas City Chiefs. They waited till the second round, came back around, and that guy was still on the board. So my antenna is up here, and the same thing with the Detroit Lions, as I've seen them mention for Femi as well. Am I going to throw him into the end of the first round? I might learn from my mistake and just hope that he's a second round target. But still, I mean, a lot of teams are, eyeing in on this guy with just a couple days left pretty much until the combine or till the draft. We're almost a month away.
Yeah, and Femi reminds me of a guy that both of us liked back in the 2023 draft, Adetomowa Adebore out of Northwestern.
Yes.
His
Yep.
game is very similar. Obviously, Adebora really hasn't done much for the Colts. Still on the roster, so he's still making an impact. But very similar game, but I think at a little bit higher of a level for Femi. I think he's a little bit quicker in terms of play speed. So we'll see. But he's getting some first round buzz. So I'd love to see him potentially squeak in there.
All right. So my next question and conversation here, we both had four running backs. My fourth running back was Quinshaw Judkins. Your fourth running back here at 47 is Travion Henderson. So what made you decide to keep Quinshaw out and only go with four quarterbacks or four running backs, excuse me, in the top 50 and Travion being your last guy to make a slot?
Yeah, I think for me, it's very similar to the wide receiver position right now. Is my top four are set, right? I don't think there's going to be any movement of people coming in or out of that top four. It's just, I'll say this right now, my 2 to 4 running backs are very close in terms of actual skill level. Maybe not exactly
Hmm.
on this list,
Yeah.
but there's definitely a chance that there's some movement between 2, 3, and 4 by the time we get to the draft. But we're talking about guys like Quinshon Judkins, Cam Scatabout, Damian Martinez, who we just went through this with our positional rankings, where I'm not entirely set on any of them as that RB5. And I think they're a lot, in my opinion. I think Quinshon Judkins is getting there for me as I watch more tape, but I think they're closer together than they are to any of the people in my top four. And that's why I just couldn't see them go into the top 50. I think, we're talking about Chavon Revel, Jaden Higgins, Darius Alexander, Jack Sawyer. Those kind of guys would be the ones that end up not going into my top 50 if I had to put in another running back. And I just don't see them having the same impact at the next level as some of those guys there.
Gotcha. All right. And your spotlight player, Shadur Sanders, 42. Matt, we got some explaining to do of a guy who could potentially be a top three pick in April.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, this is going to get, a lot of attention here. But, I'm just going to give a quick, sneak peek here. Jackson Dart's at 37, right? I mean, they're,
Oh,
they're, they're very close together. All right. And we talked about it in our QB rankings. Jackson Dart and Shador Sanders are much closer together than either of them are to Cam Ward. I think it's very clear that Cam Ward is QB1. I don't think there's any question about that. There's question about whether he's a top guy. Like, how does he grade compared to some of the top quarterbacks in the past years? Maybe not as well. But for me, with Shador Sanders and Jackson Dart, the reason why I have them so much lower is I feel like there's a lot of question marks, right? And we'll stick with Shador Sanders. I'll talk about Jackson Dart next time if we get into that. But with Shador Sanders, I feel like for him, it is very much team fit oriented, whether he has extreme success. I think his major question marks, arm strength, arm talent in general, uh, athleticism, and deep level accuracy.
yeah.
Right. And when you're thinking about a top 3 pick, I think everybody's talking about the Giants, right? The Giants are the most likely landing spot for Shador Sanders. We're hearing Cam Ward one to the Titans, most likely Abdul Carter to the Browns at number 2,
Hmm.
to create an elite pass rushing duo with Myles Garrett. So
Yeah.
Shador Sanders is going to go to the desperate Giants. And when you put him into that situation with no wide receiver help outside of Malik Neighbors, an extremely, extremely inconsistent offensive line in terms of protection, he's not going to elevate your team, right? If he goes to the Browns, I could potentially see some sort of success. He's a guy that can go in there and make an impact, be a game manager, and make things happen in the short and intermediate levels. But I don't think he's a game changer. And
Right.
if he goes in the right situation, he has the potential to be elite. But I think there's still too many question marks to say, this is a top 25 guy. If you're top 25, you're a game changer and you're going to make something happen. I think it depends on the situation for him.
Yeah. And I mean, can we go ahead and pin New York Desperate Giants instead of the New York Football Giants while we're at it? We'll credit that to you, but I agree. I think Shadur, it's looking like number three is probably going to be that hopeful sweet spot. And if the
Yep.
Desperate Giants don't want him, it becomes what team does. And we'll
Well,
see
it's
what
going to go to the
happens.
other New York team, and I'm going to be very upset.
All right. Well, we're going to move on to the next grouping here. So starting with number 40, we have Luther Burden III, wide receiver out of Missouri. 39, Carson Schwetzinger, linebacker out of UCLA. 38, Caleb Johnson, running back from Iowa. 37, there's your boy Jackson Dart, QB out of Ole Miss. 36, Kenneth Brandt, interior D-line, Michigan. Shamar Stewart, 35, edge out of Texas A&M. 34, Donovan Jackson, interior O-lineman out of Ohio State. 33, Matthew Golden, wide receiver, Texas. 32, Kelvin Banks Jr., tackle, Texas. Back-to-back Texas guys. 31, Mason Taylor, tight end out of LSU. For this one, I want to talk about Luther Burden. Let's start off again at the bottom with this, but Luther Burden this week has been the topic of conversation. Out of the first round in Daniel Jeremiah's mock draft, out of the first round in Mel Kiper's mock draft, and you now have him at 40th overall on your big board, which is potentially looking out of the first round as well. And he's your wide receiver 5. What is it with Luther Burden that's now making him potentially a second round pick versus how we were talking about this guy earlier in the process just a few weeks ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Luther Burden, it all comes down to fit, right? I think there are a lot of question marks on whether he can be a wide receiver 1 at the next level and whether he can have be consistently effective with an expanded route tree, right? We've seen how effective he can be catching the ball in the short levels of the field, at screen passes behind the line of scrimmage, and making things happen after the catch, right? He's extremely effective at that, which is why he's a very similar player to Deebo Samuel, which would make a lot of sense for the 49ers at 11, right? But after that, I don't even the Cowboys at 12. I think
Mm-hmm.
those are two spots that I could see him landing in the first round. After that, I don't see many options for him. And for me, the reason why he's so low is because of that question mark of whether he can be that wide receiver 1. I talked about how I've got my top 4 receivers, and I don't think there's going to be any changing from people going into that group. Luther Burden's currently my wide receiver 5 because those top 4, which we'll get into, Matthew Golden obviously being one of them, I think they have the ability to play multiple different roles in an offense, have an expanded route tree, and be that wide receiver 1. The wide receiver group, I mean, it hasn't really gotten too much hype, right? Everybody's talking about how it's not as great as other classes. I'm kind of on the opposite end of that. I think the top end talent is not as good, right? We're not getting Malik Neighbors. We're not getting, Jamar Chases in this class necessarily. You never know. But I think the middle portion, the 5 to 12 or 13, all have the potential to be high end wide receiver 2s. And I think that is being looked over a lot because it's not the flashy wide receiver 1 type player. Luther
Yeah.
Burden, if he ends up as my wide receiver 5 or he ends up as my wide receiver 10, he is still has the potential to be a very, very effective player at the next level. But I think the wide receiver group's kind of getting pushed under the rug because of how deep some of these other positions are. But, there were Xavier Strepo, Jalen Knoll, Ty Felton, Alec Iomanner. There were plenty of guys that I was like considering putting into this top 50 that didn't make it in.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, Luther Burden, it just all comes down to can he have an expanded route tree and can he be a wide receiver 1? I think that's the biggest question mark.
Yeah, he's another one that I had in my, penciled in mock. I had him to Denver actually because I
Yeah,
was kind
that's
of
not
on
a
that
bad spot
lower
either.
side. But I took him out.
Yeah.
Even I took him out after seeing, other experts taking him out this week. So we'll see what happens with him. Jackson Dart, you have him there at 37. We talked about this already kind of in depth at the QB conversation a few episodes back on your channel and discussions of what you had him over Shedeur Sanders. But Shamar Stewart at 35, he's your defensive end 7. Are you not kind of sold on the traits and the RAS and the perfect this and that that's going on there? And what do you see of him, in the first round, or do you see him being a second round guy? I mean, do you think a team could fall in love with the perfect 10?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a first round guy. I don't think there's any question that he gets drafted in the first round. I just don't think he's as good as the 6 guys that I have ahead of him, right? The perfect 10 RAS score is good. It's great and all, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Obviously, everybody rags about the production. I mean, we've ragged about the production forever. 4.5 sacks in his entire career. And I was watching the First Draft podcast with Mel and Field the other
Hmm.
day, and Mel said that in the last 2 seasons, he hasn't had a sack in the last 7 games of the season, right? Which means most of his sacks have come against non-conference opponents.
Exactly.
Um, that that says something too. He's going up against SEC competition, the competition he's going to see in the NFL, and he's not
Hmm.
doing anything. And I think the big thing for me is when you watch a highlight tape of him, right? You're thinking this is the number one overall pick in the draft. But when you watch the All 22 and you actually watch the film,
Or the box sheet.
you know, it's not he's not disruptive enough outside
Yeah.
of the pass rush game, right? He creates a good amount of pressures. He isn't productive getting to the quarterback. So you expect a guy of this caliber and of this physical, like a physically gifted kind of player to be disruptive elsewhere. And I don't see it enough, which is why he's down below. He's this high because if he goes to the right team with a good development team, he can be a 10 plus sack guy. With those traits, you have to be good, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to be productive at the next level. Someone has to make you good. Um, which is why if he goes to the Ravens or the Eagles, he's going to be elite. If he goes elsewhere, I don't know. We'll see. Denver's another interesting one. That if they decided to go defense, if he fell to them, that would be
Yep.
an interesting one.
That'd be a good spot.
But again, I think it all comes down to the development team. This has nothing to do with him. It all comes down to who can develop him.
Hmm. All right, so one more here before the next category. Mason Taylor, 31, your tight end three. I had him off my list. I only kept two tight ends in, and I had the two tight ends pretty high on my list. We'll see where they come in on yours later on. But you put Mason Taylor in. Is this based on the gauntlet drill he ran at the combine and how absolutely perfect and fluid that was, or is there more to it to Mason Taylor's game to make you think he's a 31 ranked prospect in this draft?
Well, he did dominate that gauntlet draw. I will tell you that. But no, I after that gauntlet draw, I went back and watched the tape, just kind of to get a little bit more context on it because I hadn't watched too much of the tight end group at that time outside of Colston and Tyler Warren,
Right.
and I just really liked what I saw. Right. I mean, he didn't get a huge target share at LSU compared to some of the other guys. Obviously, we saw Harold Fenton Jr. get like 111 receptions or whatever, and obviously Tyler Warren was a huge part of that Penn State offense. But I think when you talk about an NFL tight end, we've talked about a lot how there are two groups. They're the blocking tight ends, and then they're their receiving tight ends who, these days are more like wide receivers, like the Colson Lovelands, if will say. I think Mason Taylor and some guys that didn't make my list, like Terrence Ferguson, are
Hmm.
more dual threat kind of guys. They're guys that can get dirty in the blocking game, but also be extremely effective in the passing game. And I think that's one of the reasons why Mason Taylor is so high, is because I think he is much better than some of those other guys in this class at both
Yeah.
both abilities. Even the guys that are blocking tight ends, he's better than some of them at it. And I don't think Mason Taylor will move up my list anymore, but I think Colson Loveland's a guy we'll get to him that could potentially move down my list more
Hmm.
because of how effective Mason Taylor is. So that could be some prospect fatigue because he
Yeah.
didn't, he didn't have as great of a season this year with quarterback issues. But I like my tight ends that can do both. I like my George Kittles and Mason Taylor. He's no George Kittle, but he can do both, and I think that makes him a little bit more valuable than some of the other guys.
All right. So moving on to the 30s, or actually the 20s, 30 to the 20s.
Yeah.
Number 30, we have Gray Zabel, interior O-line from North Dakota State, your interior number two. 29, we have Trey Harris, wide receiver, Ole Miss. 28, we have Derek Harmon, interior DL, Oregon. 27, Michael Williams, edge out of Georgia. 26, Omarion Hampton, running back, North Carolina. 25, your spotlight player here is Josiah Stewart, the edge out of Michigan. 24, Tyler Booker, interior O lineman from Alabama. And 23, Walter Nolan, interior D line, Ole Miss. 22, Benjamin Morrison, cornerback, Notre Dame. And number one, Donovan Izaraku, edge out of Boston College. So I think we've talked a lot about Trey Harris. We mentioned him. I think during mine, we've talked a lot about Gray Zabel and the
Mhm.
absolute rise that he has had since the Senior Bowl. I want to start with Derek Harmon and Walter Nolan. And we'll come back into the middle here. But those two guys, the interior D line in this section, you had Derek Harmon below Walter Nolan, but still pretty close. On my list, I had Walter Nolan at 40 and Derek Harmon at 18, a pretty big gap, and I had Derek Harmon over Walter Nolan. So what makes you prefer Nolan over Derek Harmon and these two guys being so similar at this position. Because I think, into the first round and the second round, that's going to be a debate between a lot of teams is these two guys in the interior D line spot.
Yeah, I think with the interior D line spot for me, it's very fluid at the moment. Even Kenneth Grant and Darius Alexander are getting into this conversation of, who's better. I've
Hmm.
had Walter Nolan as my IDL two behind Mason Graham for the entire process. And he was well above Derek Harmon and Kenneth Grant for a long time, and they're getting closer and closer. The more
Okay.
I watch film, the more I see just some of the metrics on pressure rate and stuff like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if by draft day it's a little different potentially. But I like Walter Nolan's athleticism. I think his ability to rush both on the outside if necessary and through the gaps is really impressive. Um, I think we talked about a little bit in our IDL positional rankings a few weeks ago that his run defense isn't at the level of some of the other guys.
Yeah.
But I think it's just not the game that he plays, right?
Right.
And I think if he goes to a team that, we're talking about potentially the Eagles at 32, right? I mean, he is going to dominate in that defense if he goes into that, right? I mean, I think he would be much more effective than a Derek Harmon or a Kenneth Grant in that defense just based on, the style of player he is. But I think Walter Nolan's a guy that I think compared to the others, I don't think they will ever reach his potential as a pass rusher. I don't
Mhm.
think they have that same kind of traits that he does to make him so effective in that way. Whereas I think if he goes into the right kind of situation, he can become a better run defender, right? He can learn how to recognize play, improve his play recognition, improve his ability to bounce off blockers and get to the outside to get to the ball carrier. That's something that he can develop pretty quickly based on his athleticism, which is why I have him higher. I think that's pretty much it. I mean, he's a great pass rusher, which is a little bit more valuable. And I think there should be no issue with him becoming a better run defender. I mean, I love Derek Harmon. I think he's a guy that could potentially jump over Walter Nolan. I think we talked about him a little bit when we were going through your top 50 list. Um,
Yeah.
he's a beast, right? Massive, sits in the hole, fast for his size, right? Good
Yeah.
play speed. Um, but I think his pass rushing abilities could be improved just a little bit. And if I continue watching tape, I got a few more games of the 24 season. Might go back into the 23 season a little bit as well. If he
Mhm.
impresses me, I don't think there's any reason why he might not be above Walter Nolan by the end of the process.
All right. So your spotlight player here in this section, Josiah Stewart, and I'm beginning to think like I need to look into this guy. I think we've been looking at the wrong guy on the defensive line in this or the defensive line out of Michigan this whole time. Now, of course, Mason Graham's still going to be in the conversation for at least a top 10 lock, potentially top five. But we're seeing a lot of steam and momentum building for Josiah Stewart right now. You have him as a top 25 player on your list. Brett Coleman posted an interesting graphic earlier this week. Josiah Stewart was number one
Yep, I was
in
about to
pass
bring
rush
that
win
up.
rate.
Yep, I was about to bring
Yep.
that up.
And then commented below it, he also heard that Michigan coaching staff considered Stewart to be the toughest guy on the team, the toughest guy at Michigan. So, Matt, go ahead. A guy I didn't have on my list. Start telling me about him.
Man, Josiah Stewart is like when you watch tape, sometimes you're like, oh, when you watch tape, for example, and sometimes they, put circles around players, right, to, identify who they are. You do not need it with Josiah Stewart. He pops off the screen. Like it is
Okay, I think that might have been my problem. I think I was putting my circle around Mason Graham.
no, but he's ridiculous. He's got a very, very good pass rush arsenal. He's explosive off the line of scrimmage. He's not only a great finesse rusher, but he's powerful. He will bulldoze through an offensive tackle to get to the quarterback. And he's a guy that can rush on the outside or on the inside, go through the gaps. Really, really love his athleticism, and I think he's just going to get better. Right. I think what we saw throughout each season, he got better and better at being able to create pressure and win off the line of scrimmage. Obviously, you saw he was the best uh, at the win percentage this past season.
Yeah.
Also, interesting note: Braden Swinson, I believe, was number two. That's a guy that was
Hmm.
just outside my top 50. So, got another guy I got to watch a little more film on to see.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
Josiah Stewart's a beast. He's physical, he's tough, he's effective. He can rush off either side, he can rush in the inside, versatile. I really like what I see out of him. And if the Jets end up going offense in the first round, oh my God, would I love him at 37. I think he would be a beast.
All right, we'll see what happens with them. So another one that's a little different from mine to yours. Yours seem to be a little bit lower on Amari and Hampton. What do you make of these mid first round rumors with Amari and Hampton? Do you see him squeaking into that category? I know Mel Kiper continues to throw him in the early first rounds, like 2, 3 spots behind Ashton Genty. I don't think he's quite that level, but I do think this is a potential conversation like we saw a couple years back where Bijan Robinson was he's the only running back going in the first round. He's the surefire top 10, and then all of a sudden Jahmyr Gibbs, the Detroit Lions at 12 take him, and all of a sudden we're talking about him in the first round as a first round guy. I think we're seeing that again with Amari and Hampton's stock starting to rise. What do you make of that with him being a first round guy?
Yeah. I think the only reason why I have Amari and Hampton lower than you do is because how I already mentioned, I think 2 to 4 is very tight for me. And there's going to be, I think there's probably is going to be movement in my running back rankings. Maybe it happens multiple times where I end up moving Omar and Hampton to running back 3, then 4, then back to 2, then 3. I think there's going to be a lot of that. But I think most teams, from what I've been hearing, have Omari and Hampton as their RB2. And I don't think there's any question that he gets drafted in the first round at this point. I don't think there's any question. I mean, we're looking at the Cowboys potentially drafting running back. We're looking at the Steelers potentially drafting running back with no Najee Harris anymore. The Vikings are in the conversation for it. And then obviously with running backs in the first round, people will probably trade in if he drops, right? If we get to pick 25 and he hasn't been picked, I think there's a very good chance that a running back needy team trades into that later part of the first round and goes and gets them. So I don't think there's any question that he's going to go in the first round. It just depends on where. I think the Cowboys could get desperate and go after him and get him. I know they got Javonte Williams, but he hasn't been effective in a committee backfield. Maybe as a RB1 and a true RB3 down back in Dallas, maybe he picks up what he did at UNC again. But I think that's a possibility. And then obviously I said the Steelers at 21. And then obviously the trade ends. But I don't think there's any question. I could see 3 running backs potentially going in. But
Wow.
I think Omari and Hampton's almost a lock. If it doesn't go first round, he'll be in the first 5 picks of the second.
Yeah, I think that's for certain at the least. All right, so moving on to your top 20 now. We're going to start with Ted McMillan, wide receiver out of Arizona, number 20. He's just getting geared up for the top 20. 19, Colston Loveland, tight end, Michigan. 18, Emeka Egbuka, wide receiver, Ohio State, your number 1 wide receiver, your spotlight player. 17, Josh Simmons, offensive tackle, Ohio State. 16, Mike Green, edge out of Marshall. 15, Malachi Starks, safety from Georgia. 14, there's Cam Lord, QB1 out of Miami. 13, James Peters Jr., edge out of Tennessee. 12, Jihad Campbell, linebacker out of Alabama. And 11, Armand Mimbo, offensive tackle, Missouri. Viewers, I'll just let you start where you want to since you're getting all excited for this one. Where do you want to start? You want to start with Emeka?
Yeah, I think we got to start with the wide receivers. And
All right.
I mean, as you can see, I made a very last minute decision 2 days ago or a day ago, whenever I finalized this. Emeka Egbuka is currently my wide receiver 1. And,
Okay.
Obviously Tet is only 2 spots behind, right? Like it's not saying Amika's, a lot better than him or anything like that. But I still just have question marks about Tet, right? I mean, yeah, he ran a 4.48 allegedly. I think it's probably closer to a 4.55, but which is still great for his size, right? Like,
Exactly.
no question about that. He's still great. But I also have question marks about his route running ability. I still don't think it's that crisp. And when you combine 4.55 speed with mediocre, maybe a little bit above average route running, it's not going to go well against the best corners in the league, right? And people keep talking about how Tet's massive, he's athletic, he's had elite production at Arizona. His comparison's Drake London, and we all said the same things about Drake London when he was coming out. He had 88 receptions, over 1,000 yards, almost 10 touchdowns in his senior season, which is almost identical to Tet's numbers in his last 2 seasons, and he hasn't done anything. right? Like
Hmm.
he hasn't been special. He's been good, but has he been wide receiver one like some people were saying he should be? No. So I have no question in my mind that Tet can be an elite wide receiver one. If everything goes right. We've seen Mike Evans obviously be elite. We've seen Keenan Allen obviously be elite. Um, and Tet can be that guy, but there are question marks for me. He's not a surefire wide receiver one in the league. Whereas Emeka Egbuka, in my opinion, even if he's considered wide receiver two in your offense, I think he's a guy that's going to get 100 plus receptions, right? He's a guy that is extremely versatile, can line up in the slot, can line up outside. He can get the ball on jet sweeps or screens, and he's also extremely effective in the intermediate and deep levels of the field. He's a
Yeah.
guy that's, can make plays on the outside, can also make plays on the inside as well. Great hands. He's 6'1", so still good size receiver, right? And he's quick. He's elusive. He's good after the catch. And I think that's one thing is never sleep on Ohio State wide receivers, right? We saw it with Garrett Wilson. We've seen it with Chris Olave, even though he hasn't panned out to everything he could be.
Yeah.
And then obviously Marvin Harrison Jr. had a little bit better as he got along throughout the season. Hopefully he still picks it up. But
Yep.
I've loved Emeka Egbuka from the beginning. To be the all-time leading receptions guy at Ohio State,
With all
great,
those guys at the same
right? With
time.
all those guys that we've talked about. I just personally, if I'm going to choose one of these guys, Emeka Egbuka, Tet McMillan, Matthew Golden, Luther Burden, whoever's in your top four, Trey Harris, he's the guy that's going to have a successful career.
Yeah.
It's just that's what we're doing here. We're trying to figure out who are the best players in this draft and who are going to be impactful at the next level. And I think Emeka Egbuka, out of all the wide receivers, has the best chance and the best prospect profile to back it up to be the number one receiver next year.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discourse with Ted McMillan right now after that pro day and seeing that number. And I mean, the number doesn't concern me, like you said, with the size,
Yeah,
even if
it
it's a
doesn't. It doesn't concern.
4.55, 4.58. But the question is like, it's a similar number, the similar to production, the similar draft projection talks of Drake London, like we talked about. Drake London in 2022 went eighth overall. And then that's one side of the scale. The other side of the scale with Ted McMillan is Mike Evans, and you mentioned him as well. Seventh overall in 2014. And you're asking yourself, if you're going to draft this guy in the top 10, are you getting another Drake London who saw guys like Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave come off the board right after he did? And I bet Atlanta's probably wishing they had one of those two guys instead. Or are you getting Mike Evans, who for over a decade now has been Mr. Consistent and led that franchise down there in Tampa Bay to a Super Bowl ring to what is it, six Pro Bowls? Like, which guy are you getting in Ted McMillan, and is that worth banking your top 10 pick on for being wrong if it's not the future Mike Evans that many say? So yeah,
Yeah.
I think
And
there's
I
a lot
think
of concern.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason why Mika's up top is even if he doesn't pan out as a wide receiver one, he's going to be an extremely effective wide receiver two. Whereas if Tet McMillan doesn't pan out as a wide receiver one, there's going to be questions whether he can even be a wide receiver two, right? Like if he's
Hmm.
not effective as a wide receiver one, why would he be effective as a wide receiver two? Where Emeka Egbuka, you can put him into the Debo Samuel type role, right? Where he's just getting short yardage, getting handoffs, getting screens, and making people miss after the catch. So I think Emeka Egbuka will be a wide receiver one. Pittsburgh seems like the best choice for me personally. But we'll see. I think he'll be great.
All right, so after that, now
Yeah.
let's look at the two defensive end comparisons here that you have on this list. Mike Green at 16, James Pierce Jr. at 13. Two guys that had a lot of question marks going into the combine, still have some question marks after the combine, meeting with teams, meeting with the media, answering questions, yada yada. You still have both of them in the top 20, almost both in the top 15. Like, Mike Green's right there on the edge of the top 15 player. So you're still high on two very productive players who had some off the field concerns, and they still have them, this high on your list.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any, there's obviously the, talks about, what's wrong with their character, right? And the off the field issues. But on the field, they're two of the top three edge rushers in this class, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I don't think there's any issue when it comes to talent. And when I'm looking at this and I'm looking at some of the other guys, I love Donovan Ezraku. I love Josiah Stewart. Michael Williams, I think, still has a few question marks. He's still in my top 30, but Mike Green and James Pierce Jr. pass rushing ability is just on a little bit of another level, right? I think both. I think all three of the guys I just mentioned have the potential to be that 10 sack guy, right? But when I look at Mike Green and James Pierce Jr., if the character concerns are no issue, I'm looking at, not at the same level, but we're looking at the Myles Garrett, Aiden Hutchinson, TJ Watt tier where we're talking about 12 plus sacks every year, right? 13
Yeah.
plus sacks. They have that kind of skill set, right? No one's going to be Myles Garrett, right? Like I don't think we're going to see Myles Garrett for a long time. He was such an elite prospect, but these guys' pass rushing ability is up there. And if they go into the right situation and their character concerns aren't an issue at the next level, they're going to be a 13 plus sack type of guy. And I could see them getting up to that 15 plus sack in a couple seasons, whatever. But they're going to be in the conversation for the sacks later in the NFL, which is why I have them so high.
Yeah, I mean, I talked about James Pierce. I said he's up there potentially to rival Abdul Carter as the best edge rusher in this class, in my opinion. You still had him a little bit ranked higher because, the off the field thing is big for me in my personal rankings. But Jihad Campbell, not quite in your top 10. I had him there. Some other people have him there. What makes him not there yet for you, even after what we saw at the combine?
He's close. I wanted to put both him and Armand into my top 10, but there's still a few guys that I just prefer
Hmm.
that I put in there. And I think that's really the only reason, right? I think Jihad is great. I still have Jalen Walker ahead of him in my linebacker rankings. I've, we'll talk about Jalen Walker in a second. But it's just about who I have in my top 10. And I think the two guys that I have at 9 and 10, I like more. And that's why they're there. There's still a possibility. There's obviously you guys have seen this list, so you kind of have an idea of who's in there. But Will Johnson's a guy that could potentially drop out. I think Will Campbell's a guy that could potentially drop out of that top 10 if Armand
Hmm.
Membu surpasses him, in my
Yeah,
opinion,
yeah.
in terms of talent, right? And then obviously a guy that you had a lot lower, and Jade Barron is a potential guy that can drop out. So there are spots available, right? There's potential for these guys to move in. I had Jihad Campbell, I believe, at 17 or 18 when I released my top 25 before the combine. So he's moved up. I had Armand Membu at like 19 or 20, I'm pretty sure. So he's moved
Yeah.
up a lot as well. There's no question. They're just not in that top 10 yet, just because I'm kind of still holding on with some of those other guys.
All right, well, let's get to it. The top 10 on the big board for Matt Laguzza here. And number 10, you got your guy, Jade Barron, cornerback out of Texas. I have a feeling he's fringe top 10, but you just cannot have the heart to take him out of it, having him at the 10 spot. But then
Hey.
we have then we have 9, Nicky Manori, safety out of South Carolina. Both of us have him, I believe, in our top 10s. Number 8, Will Campbell, tackle out of LSU. 7, Will Johnson, cornerback out of Michigan. 6, Jalen Walker, linebacker out of Georgia. 5, Ashton Janty, running back out of Boise State. 4, Tyler Warren, tight end out of Penn State. 3, Mason Graham, interior D-line out of Michigan. Number 2, Travis Hunter, the athlete out of Colorado. And number 1, Abdul Carter, edge rusher, Penn State. So, Matt, let's start. We'll just go the top 10 just like we did. We'll just go player by player. So, start with Jade Barron. What makes him a top 10 player for you? Like you said, I had him a lot lower. You continue to be really high on this guy. Why is that?
I just love the way Jade Barron plays football, right? I mean,
All right.
both of us were really high on Brian Branch when he was coming out. I don't know where you had him, but I had him at like number 13 on my big board when he was coming out. And both Jade Barron and Malachi Starks are two guys that play or can play in that very similar role that he does. I
Hmm.
wanted to put Malachi Starks a little bit higher, but I mean, Nick and Monroe is just a beast. So I had to have him in my top 10. But I love the way he plays. I mean, he can play outside, he can play as a nickel, he can play as a safety, even. He's a great tackler in the open field. He's got great instincts. And he's a great leader as well, right? When you watched him at the combine and the way he spoke to the media, he's a leader, he's a great personality, and he's a guy that you want in your locker room. So not only does he have the versatility and the effectiveness in multiple positions on the defensive side of the ball, but he's a guy that you want in your locker room, which is why I had him mocked to the Jets. I don't think he will go to the Jets. I think Aaron Glenn would love to have him. I don't know if they'll go with him at 7, but he is just an all-around football player on and off the field, which is why he's just hanging in my top 10 because I
Gotcha.
I think he's going to be a special player.
Well, I will say, in a spoiler again for the mock draft, he's penciled in, and I pretty much have him. Like, I'm about to get the marker out and lock him into the team I have him with right now. So I do have a spot for him, and it is at cornerback 2. It's not to the Jets, and it's not in the top 10, but he's right there in the teens, and I like the spot I have for him. So Nick Emanwori, the fast riser out of South Carolina, another perfect 10 at the combine, and you had a much closer gap than I did. Not much, but like a few spots closer between him and Malachi Starks. And I've been the firm believer in Malachi Starks. So you still think those two are close, but Nicky Manwari, of course, gets the top 10 selection. Why is that?
Yeah. I mean, I think they're two very different safeties, right? I mean, they do two very, very different things. And I already kind of talked about it where Malachi Starks can kind of play that nickel kind of position, be in the box, be that Brian Branch kind of player at the next level. And yeah, he didn't have a great 2024 season compared to his 2023, but I mean, I don't think that should hurt him because he is still an elite player. We saw it at the combine on the on field drills. He dominated. He was the best defensive back in the entire day. There was no question about it, in my opinion. So when I look at this, yeah, Nicky Manwar has been my number one safety for probably, I mean, I'd probably say a month before the combine. So Malachi Starks was my number one safety up until then.
Yeah,
I still think they're both going to be elite at the next level. I just think they're going to be elite at two very, very different ways.
right.
And that's why I still have Malachi Stark so high. And Nicky Manwari, just watching the film, his size and his athleticism combined, I mean, he's a top 10 player in this class. I don't think it's a question.
Gotcha. So Will Campbell, number 8, tackle out of LSU. Interesting, you kept him at tackle. I think I did the same, but we're seeing now Albert Breer had his piece come out this week, and he mentioned him as a similar player to Brandon Sheriff, who's a multi-time Pro Bowler, who was the same way. He started at left tackle in college. Once he got to the league, he became just a perennial Pro Bowl guard. And moving over to left guard from left tackle. So what do you think about Will Campbell? Is it, a team preference? He wants to stay at left tackle. Either way, I think, he's on a Pro Bowl trajectory, which, is why he's a, clear top 10 player in this draft. So how do the positional difference for Will Campbell, does that affect anything for you and his fit in the NFL?
I think it does. I mean, I don't like to have bias against offensive guards, but there is. I mean, when you look at it and you're drafting an offensive tackle, right? And you're drafting someone high to be an offensive tackle if they can. And I think Will Campbell's going to do everything he can to be an offensive tackle at the next level. And I think he has the ability to do it. There's a reason I have him as number 8 on my big board. He has, even though the arms are short, he's been extremely effective in the SEC with some of the best defensive lines in the country, going up against NFL caliber players, and he dominated them, right? He was on an island and he had no issues. So I think he's going to give it a hell of a shot. But if come draft time, he comes out and he says, yeah, I'm probably going to play guard, right? And, teams are going to draft me for as a guard. He'll probably move
Mhm.
down and Armand Membu will probably go in his place. I think he's still
Yeah.
a top 15 player. I don't think there's any question about that. He still might be in my top 10. Maybe Chade Barron moves out and he moves to 10, right? I don't know. We'll see. Crazier things have happened. But Tate Ratledge was originally in my top 50, and I had to move him out because there were some other more skilled position kind of players that I wanted to move in. Aronte Ursery, a tackle, I also wanted to move in. And Wyatt Milam is another offensive tackle that has moved to guard most likely.
Yeah.
He's amazing, by the way, after watching some film. And he's another guy that's kind of on the edge, but just kind of was out of it because, skill positions take the cake, right? That's just what it
Right.
is. So, love him. Still a top 15 player, but if he moves to guard, that could potentially move Membu over because I think at the end of the day, having an all pro offensive tackle is a little bit more important than having an all pro offensive guard.
Yeah, and they pay a little bit more. That's for seeing.
That too.
So number 7, Will Johnson. You still got him as your cornerback 1. You've been a big Jade Barron truther for a long time now. But still, Will Johnson takes the cake as your top cornerback in the class. What's the difference between the two and what still puts Will Johnson over the top?
I think the blend of size, speed, and instincts are so rare when you look at Will Johnson. I mean, he's been doing this since he's a freshman. He's been elite since
Yeah.
he's a freshman in the Michigan defense, right?
Hmm.
Michigan defense is almost always a top five defense in all of college football, and you've got a freshman dominating on it, right? And he's been
Right.
doing this for 4 years. Yes, his 2024 tape wasn't as good as his 2023 tape. And yes, there are some question marks on his top end speed. But I mean, at the end of the day, does top end speed matter that much? If you go and watch a 40-yard dash and he runs, a slow 40-yard dash, that does not mean he's not going to be good on the field. Play speed and linear speed are two very, very different things. And we've seen this. I mean, look at Bucky Irving. He didn't run a
Yeah.
good 40, and he was the best rookie running back by a mile last year, right? Play speed is much more important. And we saw this with Tez Johnson as well, right? Everybody's counting him out and saying, oh, he's an undrafted free agent now because he's 5'6", 180 and or 150, and he ran a 4.55.
Yeah.
Play speed means everything. Is he in my top 10 wide receivers? No, Tez Johnson's not. But he still has a place at the next level, and he can be effective because we've seen what he can do with the pads on. And we've seen what Will Johnson can do with the pads on. Travis Hunter gives him a run for his money. Jade Barron gives him a run for his money. And I'm still a big Benjamin Morrison guy. He was still in my top 25. Really love him. But as of right now, Will Johnson, just the blend of all of his traits makes him almost the perfect prototypical outside corner.
All right. So your next one is Jalen Walker. For me, for context, the defensive end linebacker hybrid. You got Jalen Walker and you got Jihad Campbell. One's more of an undersized edge rusher. The other's more of an oversized interior linebacker and Jihad Campbell. So these two, I had them at 5 and 7. I was so torn between the two and had Will Campbell in between them for context. But you had Jihad Campbell outside of your top 10. You have Jalen Walker here at 6. What put him over, this much over Jihad Campbell? Because, that's another argument teams are going to have between these two players for the team that is, looking to draft this type of player to their defense. Who do they like better, Jihad Campbell or Jalen Walker? You like Jalen Walker a little bit better.
Yeah, I think it's another thing where there's two guys moving in opposite directions, right? I had Jalen Walker originally at number 4, I believe, on my list at one point, and he's moved to 6. And as we talked about Jihad Campbell, he's moved
Yeah.
from like 35 to 18 and now to 12 or whatever.
Yeah.
So by the time the draft comes, I would not be surprised if they are right next to each other, right? They're two elite players, they're leaders, they're good on the edge, they're good as an off-ball linebacker as well. I think with Jalen Walker, I like his ability as a rusher just a little bit more. I'm actually starting to lean a little bit more towards Jihad Campbell though, because I like his ability as an off-ball linebacker a little
Yeah.
bit better, right? And I think Jihad Campbell does better as an off-ball linebacker than Jalen Walker does as an edge rusher. So we'll see. I'm still liking Jalen Walker. I like his leadership ability. I like his ability as an off-ball linebacker, but he is moving down. Looking at it, I'm looking at Will Johnson potentially jumping him. I'm looking at Nicky Manwari potentially jumping him. Still an elite player. Still have him. I'm close to having him markered to Carolina still.
I
I'm
know. I would love
really
to too.
close. Like I'm really close still. Even if he's my 13th best player at the end of the day, I still have him. He just seems like a great fit there. No question, both of them are going to be. I don't think there's a question that they're both going to be top 10 players for me by the time the draft comes. I think it's inevitable and it'll eventually come. It just depends on who's the higher one. They're both
Right.
elite players. There's not much separating them.
All right. Ashton Genty, there is a big separation with your running backs. He is your clear cut number running back 1 and seems to be a common consensus at your 5th ranked spot. What had him at 5? I believe I had him a little bit. I had him at 4, actually. Okay, so it's kind of similar. So he had some guys above him still. Ashton Genty, what's some limitations? What is potentially going to deter a team away from him, or do you think he can go top 10, maybe even 6 overall to the Raiders? And you think it's no question they should take that guy?
Yeah, well, I think we talked about this in the running back positional rankings. He's 5'8".
Yeah.
He's not the biggest guy, and he's taking a lot of hits, right? He's known for bouncing off defenders and making big runs. So I think the biggest thing for me is how long is he going to be able to do this? Um, and I hope he does this for a very long time because we watched him in college. He's elite at what he does.
Hmm.
And if you draft him at 6, you are going to get at least a few years of elite running back work, which is why I have him as number 5, because he's a guy that's going to be 1,000-yard rusher. He's a guy that's going to break off big plays. He's going to be a guy that's like potentially in the right offense, a 15 to 20 touchdown guy, right? And he's also really good in the passing game. It got knocked down a little bit this past year just with the style of play that they had. But people forget he was almost a 600-yard receiver the year before. So he is extremely capable in the passing game as well. He's a very well-rounded back. And I think the end of the day is how long is he going to be able to put up with the hits? Is he going to have to eventually become a little bit more of a committee back if he's taking a lot of hits still and starting to get a little bit of injured due to his size? Um, but when it comes to the actual talent, he's still a lot. There's a lot more potential in Ashton Genty than there is in any of the other running backs we've talked about.
Right. And, those limitations, if I could go back in time, I think that was kind of the similar, even though he went third overall, but 5'8", he just bounced off everybody. How long can you do this? Barry Sanders.
Yep.
And he did that
For a
for
very long time.
a full decade, which back then, in the 80s or late 80s into the 90s was kind of a long time for a running back. I mean, Hall of Famer, one of the best of all time. And the only person that's come close to even touching his college rushing record was Ashton Jeanty.
Yep.
It's 5'8". How long can he do it? Can you keep bouncing off the guys?
And
Maybe a little
obviously,
bit
I
of
have him
some
at 5.
prospect
You had him
fatigue
at
there.
4. I had him at 5.
Yeah.
You had him at 4. We think he's going to do it for a long time. So, I mean, I think he should be fine. And I think Raiders drafting him at 6. I don't think there's any issue with that because when you have a running back of this quality, you get him.
Yeah, unless you're Ben Johnson, you might have some issue with that.
Yeah.
So number 4, Tyler Warren. I had him at 3. You got him at 4, but still a top 5 guy in this class. And you had him above Colston Loveland. Seems to be a common thing between the both of us. This guy's just a do-it-all, jack of all trades guy, and I think can translate very well with that in his game. Do you agree?
Yeah. No, I think he's miles better than Colson Loveland at this point in terms of his actual value to a
Hmm.
franchise. When you look at a tight end, you're looking at a quarterback's best friend, especially a young quarterback. And I believe you had, I don't know if it's still the same, but you had Tyler Warren as the Jets pick 2 mock drafts ago that we did
Yeah.
at number 7. And with Justin Fields at quarterback, I would love to have Tyler Warren as my tight end of the New York Jets. Whether we draft him at 7 or not, I don't know. We'll see. There's still a lot of other holes that they need to fix. But I mean, Tyler Warren can do everything. He can be a vertical threat. He can catch the ball behind the line of scrimmage and, get yards after the catch. You can hand it off. You can give it to him as like a wildcat quarterback and he can run with it, throw it if you want him to. Um, and he's a good blocker as well. So I think he's kind of like a do it all kind of guy and he's elite. Like he's not just a do it all guy and he's good at it. He's elite at everything he does. So
Right.
I really like him. Top 5 player. At the beginning of this process, I wasn't expecting to have a running back and a tight end in my top 5 players. But we were also expecting James Pierce to potentially be the number 1 pick in this class at the beginning of this process back
Yeah.
in like July. So things change. And I mean, Ashton Genty and Tyler Warren are by far the best pure offensive players in this draft. Obviously, Travis Hunter is a different animal, but pure offense, Tyler Warren, Ashton Genty, I don't think there's a question.
All right. So when we're talking about these top 5 prospects on your board, you have Mason Graham at 3. I had Mason Graham at 8. I think I'm eating the fatigue. I need to get off of it because I'm seeing a lot of people get on it too, and I don't think it's warranted.
Yeah.
And even looking at my list, I think having him 8 was too low. So you had him at 3. I think you're right in that. I think this guy, should be a top 5, potentially even up into the top 3 prospects in this year's class. Why are people starting to fall off on this guy? Is it just the prospect fatigue? And, we're still going to see this guy be a top pick. I mean, mock drafts keep having them start falling a little bit lower outside the top 5. And I just don't, I think people are just trying to make that just to stir some headlines.
Yeah. He's been my number three prospect for the entire process. There hasn't been any change in that. My top three, my Abdul Carter and Travis Hunter have flipped a few times, but they've always been my top three prospects. And yeah, it's all because of prospect fatigue. And I
Yeah.
also think it's there's a lot of hype coming out of this interior defensive line class, and people are saying, "Oh, you look at Kenneth Grant, what he did in Michigan." I think that's because Mason Graham was getting double teamed. I love Kenneth Grant. He's an elite player, but Walter Nolan, great, not as well rounded as Mason Graham, both in the run game and the pass rush game. I think Mason Graham is the best pass rusher in the interior of this class. But he's also arguably the best run defender in this class. He's top three, I think, in my opinion, in the interior position. But he's in the conversation for best run defender in interior. Derek Harmon's obviously a lead at that. But I think there's some truth to it, right? That he's falling a little bit. We haven't seen him perform at anything yet. It'll be interesting at the Michigan Pro Day when that comes. If he goes out there, obviously we're not going to see Colson Loveland, who we've talked about, because he's injured, which might make him fall a little bit more for me. Prospect fatigue, though. But I think there's a chance Tyler Warren and Ashton Genty jump him, in my opinion, and he moves to 5 potentially. But I think he's probably going to stay at number 3 because he's a disruptor and he's extremely effective at it. You put him like if you want to drop him to 7, I'll take him with the Jets. Him and Quinnen Williams in the middle of that defensive line. Oh my God, I would live for that. I would live for that. So I think it is unwarranted that he's dropped so much. I don't think there's any question he's a top 5 prospect.
All right, so your number 2. This is interesting. I was wondering if you'd flip this. You said you've been back and forth on it. But you had number 2, Travis Hunter. What kept him off of him being number 1? Is it just Abdul being that much cleaner of a prospect, or is it the limitations of Travis Hunter that still concerned of where he's going to play at the next level?
I think for me, it's mostly I'm actually not as high on Abdul Carter as some people are. He's a great player and he's probably going to be elite at the next level. But people are saying he's Micah Parsons. I don't know if he's going to be as good as Micah Parsons was coming out of Penn State, right? And I think a lot of the reason why he's the number 1 prospect on a lot of boards is because it is a little bit of a weaker class in terms of elite talent, right? We're not seeing as much elite talent in this class as we have in some years back. But with Travis Hunter, I think for me, him playing both ways plays a big factor into this. And I think that's why, in my opinion, he's so high on my board because it's extremely valuable and he can play at both ends and be a value pick that way. If he plays one position though, he plays wide receiver. He's in the conversation for wide receiver 1 for me. I don't think he's the guaranteed wide receiver 1. And when we talk about cornerback, he's probably in the conversation for cornerback 2 for me. I don't know if he's in that conversation for cornerback 1. So when I look at him, I'm like, he's an elite athlete and he's probably going to develop, but he's not better than my number 1 guy in either of those positions, in my opinion, which is why
Right.
it's at number 2. I think he can develop and play an even bigger role than some of those guys. But that's why it's number 2. I was considering putting him number 1. And he's moving up my board. Maybe he's my wide receiver 1 by the end of this process. I think after moving Amika up, I think there's a little bit of an opening for him to potentially get in there and be that wide receiver 1. But I think Abdul Carter being elite at his one position and being extremely effective at that one position makes him just a little bit higher for me because he's a little safer.
All right. So you got Abdul Carter number 1, and it looked like he was getting just a teensy bit of prospect fatigue, and I'm happy to see that's now out of the window this week. But everything fluctuates week to week, day to day. But it seems like Abdul Carter's back now as that number 2 guy in this year's draft, like in terms of how it's going to go in the board with Cam Ward, probably 95%, maybe a little higher shot
Whether it's
going
to the
number
Titans or
1.
someone else, he'll probably be the number 1 pick.
Yeah, and to me it seems like I would say if I put a number on it like 75, 76, Abdul Carter goes number 2 to the Browns, just how
Mhm.
things are sounding right now. So I'm glad it's because there was a time like, last week I was seeing it like should so and so team trade up if Abdul Carter falls? And like why on why in the world would Abdul Carter fall any below the top three picks? So we're out of that
Yeah,
finally. So that was a quick a quick process. So Abdul Carter's back now. Both of us had him number one. Um, you said that you're not as high on him as anyone else, but you can't be much higher than one. So
yeah,
you still see him as the guy in this
yeah.
year's class. But like we said, positionally wise, he's not going to go number one. But I agree, he's going to be the top prospect this year.
Yeah, I think for me, when I say I'm not as high as on him, as some people, is as I said, some people are comparing him to Micah Parsons coming out of
Yeah,
school. I think Micah Parsons was a better prospect than Abdul Carter, in my opinion, as a pure edge rusher. I think Abdul Carter is a better all around player potentially than Micah, but I think that's it. I think for me, it's when it comes to the comparisons to other players that have come out in previous years, and some people are comparing them to that upper echelon of players at the position, where I don't think he's at that. Still elite, just not at that point. I think the likes of Mike Green, the likes of James Pierce Jr. are closer than people are saying. But still, I don't think there's any question he's the best player in this class.
all right. And I don't think it's quite the argument with like Von Miller because I was like trying to look back at like some comps and some draft ranges for Abdul
Yeah,
Carter, and I was like Von Miller second overall. But then I looked at it, Cam Newton number one overall, Cam Ward not quite. We're talking
not
about
quite Cam Newton.
A Cam going above the best defensive end at number one, but Cam Ward is not Cam Newton, so
No, he
never
is.
mind.
All right. Well, that's the top 50s. We're done. Um,
Yep,
so
grueling process.
there are obviously some differences. I think we had 7 or 8 players that I had that you didn't. So that
Yeah.
means you had those. Um, but I think overall we had generally the same players. It just came down to positioning on here.
Yeah,
Of
and I think that makes sense. Like there's a lot of difference. Like everyone talks about that 30 to 50 to 70 range, like all those it's you know,
it's so close.
throw a dart and you're hitting
Yeah.
somebody. So it's so close and that makes sense that we have different in a top 50. Most of them were in the back end of that 50 trying to slot guys in, not slot guys in. So I think
So
that's
yeah.
kind of along with what everyone else is saying with this class.
All right. So here's my top 50 in full, all 50 players. And next up, we're going to start going through our divisional overviews. I forget which division we're going to start with on Monday. I got to look into that. But we'll go through all 4 teams, maybe do some preferred picks in the first and second rounds.
Okay.
Go through some free agent signings, losses, stuff like that. And we'll go through each division. And then as soon as we're done with that, it's drafted.
All
So
right.
coming up, getting there. Cole, this was fun doing this, and I'll see you next week for the divisional previews.
All right. Can't wait.